The life of a Mongolian horse archer. Part 1. What was it like to be a Mongolian horse archer? One of the most feared warriors in human history. A soldier in the army that conquered more territory than any empire before or since. A man who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. Who could survive for weeks on the open steppe with nothing but his horse and a bag of dried meat? Who helped build an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary? This isn't a question about romantic nomadic freedom or Hollywood horseback heroics. This is a question about the brutal, practical reality of being a soldier in the Mongol military machine during the 13th century. What you ate, how you trained, what you wore, how you fought, how you died. Because the Mongolian horse archer wasn't some mystical warrior who emerged fully formed from the steppe. He was the product of a specific culture, a specific environment, and a specific military system that turned ordinary nomadic herdsmen into the most effective light cavalry the world had ever seen. His life was hard in ways modern people can barely imagine. Constant physical hardship, exposure to extreme weather, diet that would horrify nutritionists, hygiene that would shock doctors, violence that was casual and omnipresent. But it was also a life that produced warriors of extraordinary toughness, skill, and tactical sophistication. A Mongolian horse archer could ride for days without rest, survive in conditions that would kill most people, coordinate complex maneuvers with thousands of other horsemen using nothing but signal flags and horn blasts, and execute battlefield tactics that European armies wouldn't match for centuries. So who were these men? How did they live? What made them so effective? And what was the actual day-to-day experience of being a horse archer in Genghis Khan's army? Let's start with the most fundamental fact. A Mongolian horse archer was first and foremost a herder. The Mongol military wasn't a professional standing army in the way we think of modern militaries. It was the entire adult male population of Mongolia mobilized for war. Every Mongol man was expected to be a warrior, because every Mongol man grew up herding animals on horseback. This is crucial to understanding Mongol military effectiveness. When European armies recruited soldiers, they had to take peasant farmers who had never ridden horses and train them for years to become cavalry. The Mongols didn't need to do this. A Mongol boy was put on a horse as soon as he could walk literally around age 3 or 4. By age 5, he was riding independently. By age 10, he was helping herd sheep, goats, cattle, and horses across vast distances. By age 15, he was a skilled horseman who could ride all day, who understood horses instinctively, who could control his mount with just his knees while using both hands for other tasks. This wasn't military training. This was just normal childhood. The result was that when Genghis Khan needed soldiers, he didn't need to train men to ride horses. They already could. He just needed to organize them and give them weapons. The training for archery followed a similar pattern. Mongol boys started learning to shoot bows around age 5 or 6, starting with small bows and gradually working up to full-sized composite bows as they grew stronger. By adolescence, a Mongol boy could shoot accurately while standing still. By adulthood, he could shoot accurately while riding first at a walk, then at a trot, then at a gallop. This took years of practice. Thousands and thousands of arrows shot. Muscles developed specifically for drawing a powerful bow repeatedly. But again, this wasn't military training. It was practical skills needed for hunting, for protecting herds from wolves and thieves, for survival on the steppe. The Mongol composite bow was a technological marvel made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, capable of penetrating armor at significant distances and small enough to use effectively from horseback. Drawing one required enormous strength. The draw weight was typically 100–160 pounds, compared to 60–80 pounds for European longbows. Modern people who try to draw authentic Mongol bows often can't pull them back at all. Mongol warriors trained from childhood could draw them smoothly, hold the draw, aim and release with deadly accuracy. And they could do this dozens of times in battle without their arms giving out. So by the time a Mongol man was called up for military service, typically around age 15 to 20, he already had all the basic skills: horsemanship, archery, endurance, comfort with violence, from hunting and tribal warfare, and most importantly, he was already accustomed to the hardships of nomadic life. He knew how to find water on the steppe, how to survive extreme cold and heat, how to navigate by stars and landmarks, how to repair his own equipment, how to treat injured horses, how to live for extended periods away from permanent settlements. These weren't things the military had to teach him. The Mongol military machine's genius was taking these already skilled horsemen and organizing them into a disciplined, coordinated fighting force. The organization was decimal, units of 10, Arban, 100, Jagun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen. Every soldier knew his place in this hierarchy, knew who commanded him, knew which soldiers fought beside him. The Arban, the unit of 10, was the basic building block. These 10 men often came from the same clan or region, knew each other personally, trained together, fought together. They were responsible for each other. If one man fled in battle, the entire Arban could be punished or executed. This created powerful incentive for unit cohesion. It also meant that Mongol cavalry could execute complex maneuvers with precision that European cavalry couldn't match, because European cavalry was typically composed of individual knights with their own retainers, not organized into standardized units with clear chain of command. Now let's talk about daily life on campaign, because this is where the reality of being a Mongol horse archer gets truly harsh. When the Mongol army was on the march, which was most of the time during the great conquests of the 13th century, a warrior's life was defined by constant movement, minimal supplies, and brutal physical demands. A typical Mongol warrior carried relatively little: his bow and 2 or 3 quivers of arrows, about 60 arrows total, a sword or axe, perhaps a spear or lance, a lasso, used for capturing enemy soldiers or horses, a leather helmet, a coat of leather or lamellar armor, if he could afford it. Many light cavalry wore no armor at all, spare bowstrings, a small leather bag containing needle and thread for repairs, a whetstone for sharpening weapons, fire-starting materials, and a small cooking pot. That was it. No tent Mongol warriors slept in the open or under their horses for warmth. No change of clothes. They wore the same deal, traditional Mongol robe, and trousers until they rotted off. No bedroll. They slept on the ground wrapped in a felt cloak if they were lucky. Food was also minimal and portable. The most important was Bort's dried meat, usually beef or mutton, that had been pounded into powder. A small bag of Bort's could sustain a warrior for weeks. You mixed it with water to make a kind of soup, or you just ate it dry. Mongol warriors also carried dried curd, arul, fermented milk products that were lightweight and long-lasting. And they had a brilliant system for sustenance using their horses. If food ran out, a warrior could make a small cut in his horse's neck vein, drink a cup or 2 of blood, then seal the wound. The horse would recover, and the warrior had protein-rich sustenance without killing his mount. This sounds barbaric to modern sensibilities, but it was actually a sophisticated survival technique that allowed Mongol armies to campaign in areas with no food supplies. They brought their food supply with them in the form of living horses. Speaking of horses, each Mongol warrior typically had 3 to 5 horses on campaign, not 3 to 5. This is absolutely critical to understanding Mongol military mobility. The warrior would ride one horse for a few hours, then switch to a fresh mount, allowing the first horse to rest while being led. By rotating through multiple horses, Mongol cavalry could travel 60-80 miles per day, sometimes up to 100 miles in emergency situations, without the horses collapsing from exhaustion. European cavalry, with 1 horse per rider, could manage maybe 20-30 miles per day. This difference in strategic mobility was devastating. Mongol armies could appear where enemies didn't expect them, could retreat faster than enemies could pursue, could campaign in winter when European armies were in winter quarters. But having 3 to 5 horses also meant that each warrior was responsible for managing a small herd while on campaign. You had to keep track of your horses, make sure they were fed and watered, check them for injuries, replace horseshoes. Though Mongols typically didn't shoe their horses, the hooves were naturally hard from growing up on rocky steppe terrain, and make sure they didn't stray or get stolen. This was constant work. Life on campaign for a Mongol warrior was not glorious charges and heroic duels. It was endless riding, managing horses, sleeping rough, eating monotonous food, dealing with weather. The Mongolian climate is one of the harshest on Earth, with summer temperatures over 100 degrees Celsius and winter temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius. Mongol warriors campaigned in both extremes. The winter campaigns were particularly brutal. Soldiers would wrap themselves in layers of felt and fur, but frost was constant. Hands and feet would go numb. Frostbite was common. Many Mongol veterans were missing fingers or toes. Water would freeze, so warriors melted snow in their mouths. Horses struggled to find forage under snow. Yet the Mongols deliberately campaigned in winter because rivers and marshes froze, making terrain passable that was impassable in summer, and because sedentary civilizations didn't expect winter campaigns and were unprepared for them. Part 2. Now let's talk about combat. Because this is ultimately what defined the life of a Mongol horse archer, the moments of intense violence that punctuated the long periods of marching, waiting, and camp routine. Mongol battle tactics were sophisticated and remarkably consistent across decades of conquest, which tells us they were thoroughly trained and drilled. The basic tactical unit was the arban, the group of 10. Multiple arbans formed a jagon of 100, and these were the units that executed battlefield maneuvers. Mongol cavalry typically fought in loose formations, not the tight formations of European cavalry. This gave them flexibility. They could spread out to avoid enemy missiles, contract to concentrate force, wheel and turn rapidly. The key to Mongol tactics was mobility and archery. They would approach the enemy, typically in several waves. The first wave would gallop toward the enemy line, shooting arrows from about 50-200 yards distance, close enough to be accurate, far enough to avoid melee. Then they would wheel away before contact, riding parallel to the enemy line, or even turning their horses completely around while continuing to shoot backward. The famous Parthian shot that required enormous skill. Wave after wave of horse archers would do this, harassing the enemy, shooting thousands of arrows, trying to break formation or provoke a charge. This is where discipline became crucial. European heavy cavalry, frustrated by this harassment, would often charge the Mongol horse archers. This was exactly what the Mongols wanted. The Mongols would retreat not in panic, but in organized withdrawal, still shooting arrows backward as they fled. The European knights, weighed down by heavy armor and riding slower horses, would pursue. They'd chase the Mongols for miles, getting strung out, getting exhausted. And then the Mongol retreat would suddenly stop. Fresh Mongol cavalry that had been hidden or held in reserve would appear on the flanks and rear. The pursuing Europeans would find themselves surrounded, their horses blown, their formations scattered. And the Mongols would close in, still using bows primarily, shooting into the confused mass of enemy cavalry from all sides. Only when the enemy was completely disrupted would Mongol warriors close for melee combat with swords, axes and lances. And even then, they preferred to break off and resume archery if possible. The Mongol tactical philosophy was, never fight fairly, never commit to melee if you can win at range, always preserve your own forces while destroying the enemy. They would retreat for days if necessary, drawing enemies into ambushes, exhausting them, destroying them piecemeal. For the individual horse archer, battle was chaos and terror, punctuated by intense focus. You're galloping at full speed, controlling your horse with your knees because your hands are on your bow. You're trying to keep formation with your arban while watching for signals from your commander flags, horn blasts, messengers galloping along the line. You're shooting arrows as fast as you can draw and release. An experienced archer could shoot 6 to 8 arrows per minute, meaning in a 10-minute engagement, you might shoot 60-80 arrows, exhausting your supply and needing to grab more arrows from spare quivers or dead comrades. You're watching for enemy arrows incoming missiles that could kill you or your horse instantly. You're breathing hard, your heart is pounding, you're covered in sweat despite the cold because of the adrenaline and physical exertion. You're trying not to think about the fact that if your horse falls or is killed, you're dead unmounted on a battlefield full of cavalry, you have no chance. The noise is overwhelming. Thousands of horses thundering, men shouting, horns blowing, the whistle of arrows, the screams of wounded men and horses. You can barely see because of dust kicked up by thousands of hooves. You follow your unit, trust your training, shoot when you have targets, retreat when signaled, advance when ordered. And then there's the killing. Modern people often romanticize historical warfare, but let's be clear about what a Mongol horse archer did. He killed people for a living, often civilians. The Mongol strategy included systematic massacre of populations that resisted, and ordinary warriors participated in this. After capturing a city, Mongol soldiers were often ordered to kill all inhabitants. This wasn't done by commanders. It was done by regular warriors going house to house, killing men, women, children, elderly. The sources describe Mongol warriors being assigned quotas. Each warrior responsible for executing a certain number of captives. They would line up prisoners, kill them with swords or arrows, and move to the next group. This was mass murder on industrial scale, and ordinary horse archers were the instruments. Some of them probably felt nothing killing was part of the job, and steppe culture was brutal. Some probably felt revulsion, but did it anyway because disobedience meant death. Some probably volunteered enthusiastically because there was loot to be had from the dead. The psychological reality of being a Mongol warrior included participation in atrocities that would qualify as war crimes and genocide by modern standards. But for the warriors themselves, this was simply war as they understood it. Steppe culture was Darwinian survival of the fittest, winner takes all. Mercy was weakness. The Mongols gave cities one chance to surrender peacefully, promising that those who submitted would be spared and integrated into the empire. But those who resisted were destroyed utterly, and this destruction was public, deliberate, and extreme specifically to terrorize other cities into surrendering. From the Mongol perspective, this was logical. Massacre one city completely, and 10 other cities surrender without a fight, saving Mongol lives and time. From the perspective of the victims, obviously, it was horror. But the Mongol warrior executing these policies was not a sadist. Usually there were certainly sadists, as in any army. He was a pragmatist doing what his culture and commanders told him was necessary for victory. This doesn't excuse it, but it contextualizes it. The life of a Mongol horse archer included moral dimensions that we should not ignore. He was simultaneously a skilled professional warrior, a survivor of harsh conditions, and a perpetrator of mass violence against non-combatants. Now let's talk about what happened to Mongol warriors outside of battle, because disease, injury, and hardship killed more soldiers than combat. The Mongol army had basic medical care. There were shamans and healers who knew herbal remedies, how to set broken bones, how to treat wounds. But by modern standards, medicine was primitive. A serious wound, a deep cut, broken bone, internal injury was often a death sentence. Infection would set in. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds could become fatal. Soldiers would die slowly of sepsis, fever consuming them while they lay in camp with nothing to be done. Frostbite led to gangrene, which meant amputation with crude tools, and no anesthesia warriors would be held down while a limb was cut off. Then the stump was cauterized with hot metal to stop bleeding. Many died from shock or infection afterward. Dysentery was constant problem-contaminated water, poor sanitation, parasites. Entire units would be incapacitated by intestinal disease, men too weak to ride, suffering dehydration and bloody diarrhea, respiratory infections in winter, heat exhaustion in summer, malnutrition when supplies ran short. These were constant threats. A Mongol warrior's life expectancy wasn't long. Many died in their 20s or 30s, worn down by accumulated injuries, disease, and hardship, even if they never took a fatal arrow. Those who survived long enough to become veterans men in their 30s and 40s, who had campaigned for 10-20 years, carried the marks of their service. Missing fingers or toes from frostbite, scars from arrows, swords, falls from horses, damaged joints from years of riding and archery, partial deafness from being near horn blasts and screaming horses, respiratory problems from breathing dust and smoke. These were the lucky ones, they had survived. But survival came at physical cost that modern people with our cushy lives can barely comprehend. The daily chronic pain of old injuries, the difficulty of simple tasks when you're missing fingers, the exhaustion of continuing to campaign when your body is broken. This was reality for veteran Mongol warriors, and they couldn't retire to comfortable civilian life. The Mongol military system required service until death or incapacity. You fought until you couldn't anymore, and then maybe you could return to herding, but even then, you'd be expected to fight if the Khan called. What about rewards? What did a Mongol warrior get for all this hardship and danger? The answer is loot and status. The Mongol army operated on systematic plunder. After capturing a city or defeating an enemy, there was organized looting. Everything of value was collected and distributed according to rank. Commanders got the largest shares, but even ordinary warriors received portions: gold, silver, silk, weapons, armor, livestock, enslaved captives. This loot was essential. It was how warriors enriched themselves and their families. A successful campaign could make a warrior wealthy by steppe standards. He could return home with horses, valuable goods, enslaved laborers to help his family, and stories of glory that increased his status in his clan. Unsuccessful campaigns meant you got nothing except wounds and hardship. There was also promotion possibility. Mongol military meritocracy meant skilled warriors could rise through ranks regardless of birth. A talented commander from a minor clan could become a Minghan commander, leading 1,000 men, or even a Tumen commander, 10,000 men, gaining enormous wealth and power. But this required not just skill, but also ruthlessness, political acumen, and luck. What about family life? Mongol warriors on campaign were separated from their families for months or years at a time. Wives and children stayed with the tribe's herds and camps, moving seasonally, while the men went to war. Communication was minimal: no letters, no way to know if family members were alive or dead. A warrior might return after 2 years away to find his wife had died in childbirth, his children had been killed in a raid by rival tribes, his herds had been stolen. Or he might not return at all, dying hundreds of miles away, and his family would never know what happened to him. They'd simply wait and eventually assume he was dead. Women in Mongol society had more rights and autonomy than in many sedentary civilizations. They managed households, made economic decisions, sometimes fought in warfare, but they still bore enormous burdens when men were away at war. They had to protect herds from theft, maintain family wealth, raise children alone, survive harsh conditions without male labor. The wives of Mongol warriors were tough, competent survivors in their own right. For the warriors themselves, the separation from family was simply part of life. You said goodbye, knowing you might never return, and then you tried not to think about it. You focused on immediate concerns, staying alive, following orders, looking out for your Arban comrades. Emotional expression wasn't encouraged in Mongol military culture. Stoicism, toughness, endurance without complaint were valued. A warrior who talked constantly about missing his family would be mocked. You kept those feelings inside, dealt with loneliness and homesickness privately, maintained the hard exterior expected of a warrior. This emotional repression probably created significant psychological problems, what we'd now recognize as depression, anxiety, PTSD, but these weren't acknowledged or treated. You simply endured. If you broke down, if you couldn't handle the stress, if you showed cowardice or weakness, you'd be punished, possibly executed, so you locked it away and kept going. Religion and spirituality provided some comfort. Mongols practiced shamanism belief in spirits, ancestors, Tengri, the sky god, sacred mountains and rivers. Warriors would pray before battle, make offerings to spirits, consult shamans for divination. Many wore amulets for protection. When comrades died, there were funeral rituals, though these were often abbreviated on campaign. A warrior might be buried in a shallow grave with his weapons, or if time was short, simply left where he fell with a brief prayer. Veterans grew fatalistic. You survived or you didn't, and worrying about it was pointless. Many developed superstitions, lucky items they carried, rituals they performed before battle, beliefs about which omens meant death and which meant survival. This gave psychological illusion of control in situations that were actually random and chaotic. Let's talk about the end of a warrior's life, because this is often glossed over in romantic histories. Most Mongol warriors didn't die in glorious charges. They died from infected wounds, disease, falls from horses, freezing to death when separated from their units, starving when supply lines failed, or they died in the chaotic brutality of close combat hacked by a sword, trampled by horses, bleeding out slowly from an arrow wound. Death on the battlefield wasn't quick and heroic. It was painful, terrifying, often slow. Wounded warriors who couldn't ride would be left behind. There was no elaborate medical evacuation. If you couldn't keep up, you were abandoned. You might die alone, far from home, with no one to witness or record your death. Your body would rot in a field or be eaten by scavengers. Your family would never know where or how you died. This was the reality for thousands of Mongol warriors. The ones we remember are the great generals, the successful campaigns, the empire that was built. We don't remember the individual soldier who died of dysentery in some forgotten valley, whose name is lost to history, who suffered and died for an empire he barely understood. So what was the life of a Mongolian horse archer actually like? It was a life of extraordinary hardship, constant danger, brutal violence, and minimal comfort. It was a life that required physical toughness, mental resilience, and practical skills that took decades to develop. It was a life that offered the possibility of glory, wealth, and status, but that usually delivered pain, loss, and early death. It was a life shaped by a harsh environment, a martial culture, and a military machine that was the most effective of its era, but that consumed its soldiers without sentiment. The Mongol horse archer was not a romantic figure. He was a professional killer, a survivor, a man doing a brutal job in brutal conditions because that was what his society demanded and because the alternatives, dishonor, poverty, death, were worse. He was extraordinarily skilled at what he did. He was part of a military system that conquered half the known world. But he was also cold, hungry, scared, in pain, far from home, and surrounded by death. That's the reality we should remember. Not the myth of the invincible warrior, but the human being who suffered and endured to build an empire that would outlive him.